If you're still awake at this hour, you already know why. A current of cold air just brushed past your shoulder, didn't it? Listen closely to the quietest sound you can hear right now, past the static of the microphone, past the hum of your own living room. Do you hear that faint, low thrum, a resonant, almost biological sound that seems too slow, too deep to be natural? That is the sound of the pressure building in the deep scattering layer, miles below the surface, where light dies and things begin to breathe differently. Tonight, we are not looking for monsters with teeth. We are looking for the laws of physics collapsing under the weight of the water itself. This journey, I promise you, will take more strength than you think. You probably won't make it to the surface after this one. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. If you are listening live, drop your current location and local time in the comments. We need to know who is still watching as the world shrinks around us. Headphones on, world off. The abyss is waiting. We were working the shelf break, far north, where the Aleutian Trench starts to gnaw at the continental slope. The vessel was the Resilient, a mid-range commercial survey boat converted for research by a consortium that didn't ask too many questions about funding sources. My job was technical observer and sonar operator, riding alongside Captain Kalen, a man whose face looked less like skin and more like ancient, salt-cured driftwood. Kalen had spent 60 years talking to the water in a way I never would. He listened to the low resonance, the shifting currents, the quiet mathematics of the deep. I trusted his silence more than any automated warning system we had on board. It started subtly, a glitch I almost dismissed as atmospheric noise clipping the high-band telemetry. We were running standard grid patterns, checking for hydrothermal vents, pulling up nothing but cold mud and the occasional, deeply unhappy specimen of abyssal fauna. The ocean floor here was flat and unremarkable, about 500 meters down. But then the primary X-band radar picked up a contact. It was solid, too solid. We called it simply the static echo. Check the calibration, Elias, Kalen murmured, his voice the sound of sand being poured into a tin can. He hadn't even looked up from his chart table, but he knew. He always knew when the machine lied, or when it suddenly started telling too much truth. I toggled the filter stack, ran diagnostics on the transponder, and checked the Doppler shift analysis. The echo was 2 nautical miles off our starboard stern, holding position. I ran the Resilient into a gradual turn, shifting our heading 90 degrees, monitoring the contact. It maintained its distance. We increased speed to 12 knots. The echo maintained its distance, staying exactly 2 miles off, mirroring our vector perfectly. This was a physical impossibility. In these latitudes, even a massive submerged object, a wreck, a whale carcass, a natural phenomenon, would be subject to the strong, deep currents that scour the shelf. It would drift, however subtly. If it was a vessel, it would have to be moving in sync with us, deliberately, maintaining a speed and trajectory that was both flawless and senseless. We were in international waters, but far from any regular shipping lane. There was nothing out here but us, the silence, and the weight of 7,000 cubic kilometers of dark water. Could be a seismic ghost, I suggested, trying to anchor the impossible in science. Sometimes, large geological formations or sharp thermal boundaries could create false echoes, bending the radar pulse. Kalen finally looked up. His eyes were the color of glacial meltwater. Seismic ghosts flicker, Elias. They scatter. This thing is painted onto the radar display like it was nailed there. It's got mass, Elias, and it's deliberate. The mythic/speculative concept of the deep often involves physics that simply don't translate to our world. I remember reading old, discredited Navy reports, whispers about things in the abyss that existed only as persistent resonance, entities that didn't move through the water but moved the water around them. The deep static, they said, wasn't noise, it was a veil. And sometimes, something poked through. For the next 4 hours, we ran maneuvers, high-speed zigzags, drifting silent with the engines cut, even dropping a passive hydrophone array to check for cavitation or engine signatures. Nothing. The hydrophones registered only the faint, abrasive grinding of the seafloor plates miles beneath us, and the low, constant pressure hum. Yet, the X-band radar held the target. 2 miles off the stern. Fixed. The curiosity, initially a mild itch, started transforming into genuine fear. This wasn't a technical anomaly. This was an event with intention. "Pull up the net," Kalen ordered, breaking the silence. We weren't trawling that morning. We were surveying. But when Captain Kalen issued an order, it wasn't a suggestion. I knew what he was thinking. If the object was fixed, and if it wasn't reacting to our presence by moving away or broadcasting a signal, it might be tied to a specific point on the seafloor, and perhaps we had drifted directly over the object's anchor point while trying to outrun the echo. It took 40 minutes to winch the wide-mouthed trawl net up from 500 meters. As it broke the surface, it was mostly empty, slicked with black benthic mud and housing a few pathetic, pressure-adapted fish. But tangled high in the nylon webbing was something else. It was a piece of synthetic fabric, perhaps a square meter in size, frayed at the edges but otherwise perfectly intact. It looked like the kind of industrial polymer used in high-stress offshore moorings or deep-sea environmental suits. A dense, woven white fiber. Kalen was at the rail before I was. He took the net hook and pulled the fabric free, holding it out at arm's length. And then I felt the heat. I mean genuine, palpable warmth. Not hot, but definitely above ambient air temperature. Utterly impossible for something pulled from near-freezing abyssal water just moments ago. It felt like it had been sitting next to a running engine block. Kalen's face, which had been unreadable for 6 decades, showed a fleeting, raw expression of terror. He didn't speak. He just turned the fabric over and over, his thumb brushing a faint, metallic sheen on one edge. "What is it?" I asked, my voice suddenly thin. "A mark," Kalen whispered, the sound catching in his throat. "A scrap from something that moves in the dark." We pulled it up, Elias. We brought the Echo's footprint onto the deck. I watched him baffled. "A mark for what? A buoy? Lost equipment?" Kalen didn't answer the question. Instead, he started talking about the old days, about a vessel named the Orion's Folly 30 years prior. The captain of the Folly, a man named Silas, had been trawling off the shelf further west when his radar showed a fixed, impossible target. The same story, the same immovable ghost. Silas, being a pragmatic and greedy man, decided to send a remote submersible down, determined to salvage whatever was worth keeping. He found nothing but brought back something exactly like this fabric. Silas, fascinated by the unnatural warmth, folded the scrap and kept it in his pocket, a morbid curiosity. 3 days later, the Orion's Folly vanished without a distress signal, leaving only a single life raft adrift, empty, but with the tether snapped clean, as if something impossibly strong had pulled the occupied raft straight down. They found the raft, but they never found Silas or the fabric, Kalen said, his eyes now locked on the object in his hand. The Echo doesn't follow those who avoid it, Elias. It marks those who are curious enough to touch what it leaves behind. The realization hit me with the weight of the water above us. This wasn't a technical glitch or an aggressive competitor. This was an invitation, and accepting it meant erasure. "Get the ship moving," Kalen snapped, his usual slow demeanor gone, replaced by frantic urgency. "South by southeast. Maximum sustained speed. We run now." He didn't wait. He stepped back to the rail, holding the fabric over the dark water. The synthetic material seemed to glow faintly, an oily sheen catching the weak morning light. "You take it back," Kalen commanded the sea, his voice raw. He dropped the warm material. It hit the surface without a splash, as if swallowed by velvet. I turned the helm hard, slamming the throttles forward. The Resilient shuddered, fighting the current, her bow pointing away from the fixed anomaly. We were accelerating fast, pushing the old engines harder than they wanted to go. I glanced at the X-band radar display, expecting the echo to hold steady, mocking our retreat, maintaining its 2-mile gap. But as soon as the ship's bow bit the waves, and we committed fully to flight, the contact on the radar dissolved. It didn't fade, it simply blinked out, leaving behind only the clear, deep blue of the empty screen. I stood there, heart hammering, watching the empty spot where the echo had been painted so perfectly just moments before. Kalen rested a heavy, salt-stained hand on my shoulder. The ocean doesn't hide things from us. It just waits until we forget. We had spent days trying to understand the principles of deep-sea navigation and sonar physics, looking for the limits of the known world. But what we faced was simple, ancient acceptance. We had been granted a warning, and we took it. The lesson Kalen taught me that morning was that true survival wasn't about finding the answers. It was about knowing which questions would kill you if you spoke them out loud. We ran south for 36 hours without stopping, leaving the coordinates of the static echo unmarked on the chart. The synthetic fabric, the piece that had been unnaturally warm, is probably already 500 meters back on the seabed, waiting for the next vessel foolish enough to drag the bottom and disturb the silence. The flight from the static echo was swift, absolute, and financially disastrous. Kalen anchored the Resilient in a neutral port, paid me off generously, and told me, simply, to walk away from the deep water for a while. He seemed to believe that if we didn't return to the Bering Sea, the mark we had momentarily held would fade. But the cold, synthetic heat of that fabric stayed on my skin, and the memory of that perfectly stationary ghost on the radar screen refused to settle. I drifted south, eventually finding temporary work in a forgotten pocket of the western coastline, a place near Port Renfrew, on the outer edge of Vancouver Island. The job was mundane, surveying a collapsed, century-old pier that was slated for demolition. It had once been a fueling and logistics hub for a small, now-defunct whaling operation. The place reeked of brine, diesel, and historical decay. My role was simple: map the subsurface structure, assess the integrity of the remaining creosote pilings, and mark where the blasting charges should be placed. I was Elias the Observer again, trading radar physics for terrestrial engineering. I spent the first day in a dry suit, suspended below the pier, moving slowly between the massive, barnacle-encrusted wooden columns. The water here was dark, cold, and surprisingly turbulent despite the shelter of the bay. I was looking for stress fractures, rot, or unusual sedimentation. What I found instead were the gouges. They weren't natural wear. Natural erosion from logs, ice, or stray vessels leaves smooth, wide scrapes. These were precise, deeply incised tracks that cut into the treated wood. The pilings, roughly a meter thick, had been scored in long, parallel lines, sometimes 3 or 4 together, running vertically from below the low tide line all the way up to where the wood met the concrete cap. They looked like the scratches left by something massive, metallic, and impossibly sharp. The disturbing part was the apparent lack of age. The creosote treatment on these pilings was designed to withstand centuries, forming a hardened, almost black shell. But where the gouges were, the wood fibers looked fresh, pale and splintered, as if the carving had happened recently, perhaps within the last few weeks, maybe even days. I reported the damage, chalking it up vaguely to some unknown deep-sea cable dredging operation gone astray. My supervisor, a demolition expert named Rourke, merely grunted. "Just mark the wood, Elias. Everything goes down in 3 days." The demolition began with a team of heavy-lift barges and divers sent to secure the support cables. The structure was tougher than Rourke expected. The old whalers had overbuilt everything, sinking the pilings deep into the muddy seafloor. On the second day, the crane operator signaled a major snag. The divers were instructed to check the base of the central pilings, 30 feet down. They surfaced moments later, reporting something that defied logic. "Sir," the lead diver shouted across the water, his voice amplified by the PA system, "there are chains. Massive ones, wrapped around the main cluster of support pilings. Not cables, sir. Chains. These weren't simple mooring chains. When the team finally managed to secure the hook and started winching them up, the groaning of the steel cables and the straining of the hydraulic motor suggested the chains weighed several tons. Slowly, agonizingly, they broke the surface. The sight was immediate, chilling awe. They were colossal links of wrought iron, thick as a man's torso, encrusted with centuries of mineral deposits and sessile life. A bizarre, petrified rope of black metal. They looked ancient, dredged from a time when ships were built from oak and men were desperate to bind the sea. The moment they came free of the water, they swung heavily, dripping black sludge. But what terrified Rourke, the crane operator, and me, was that the chains were attached to absolutely nothing else. There was no anchor, no concrete block, no vestige of a sunken vessel. They were simply wrapped tightly, layer upon layer, around the old wooden pilings, descending into the muddy obscurity of the bay floor, only to end abruptly, as if they had been severed, or, more disturbingly, as if they had been meticulously wrapped around the pilings and then simply ceased to exist below that point. Why? I asked Rourke, staring at the sheer size of the links. Mooring chains need anchors. These were holding the pilings to the seafloor, but they don't connect to anything solid down there. Rourke, a man who believed in tonnage and stress factors, just shook his head, baffled. The weight is impossible, Elias. We pulled up at least 50 meters. That's 10 tons of iron, maybe more, and it wasn't connected to a single thing. We shouldn't have been able to lift them without shearing the cables. The mythic concept of containment clicked into place. They hadn't been mooring the dock. They had been mooring the bay. We spent the rest of the day cutting the chains free, separating the massive iron links into piles of scrap, heavy trophies of a forgotten maritime ritual. As the last, blackened link was tossed onto the demolition barge, the air above the water felt thin. The absence of the physical mass seemed to create a negative pressure, a psychic void. That night, I was reviewing the sonar scans near the site. The dock was mostly rubble now, the water open where the central pilings had been. I was joined by the night security guard, a gaunt, jumpy man named Finn. Finn was pale. He held a large thermos cup with both hands, staring out at the empty water. "It's the noise, Elias," he muttered, not looking at me. "The scraping." "What noise, Finn?" "The chains. They're still there. I hear them dragging." I listened hard. The only sounds were the soft, rhythmic lapping of the tide against the shore and the low, distant groan of a buoy on the inlet mouth. No metal. No scraping. "You're hearing things, Finn. They're all on the barge." "No," Finn insisted, his voice trembling. "It's where they were. Right over the center pilings. It sounds like something heavy, massive, is dragging itself across the bottom of the bay, pulling those chains. And they removed the pilings, Elias. There's nothing left to wrap them around." I spent an hour with Finn, trying to logically dismiss the sound as residual noise, or the stress of the demolition job getting to him. But the look in his eyes wasn't fatigue. It was the raw, open terror of witnessing something fundamental shift out of alignment. Just as I was about to call the local police to report Finn for psychological distress, the water changed. We were looking out over the patch where the pier had been, maybe 30 meters offshore. The surface, which had been mildly choppy, suddenly went unnaturally flat. It wasn't the glassine calm of a summer evening. It was the inert, dead stillness of oil. The water didn't reflect the moonlight. It absorbed it, turning the surface into a sheet of polished obsidian. Then, the movement began. It wasn't a wave, not a ripple. It was a disturbance under the surface, a displacement of mass too large and too close to be a whale, too slow to be a school of fish. It was a dark, impossibly wide shape, gliding just inches below the waterline. It had no discernible edges, no defining features. It was merely the absence of light and volume, moving with the sluggish, heavy grace of a geological process. It moved slowly across the entire width of where the pier had stood, paused exactly over the site of the central pilings. the spot where the massive, empty chains had been cut free, and then began a long, deliberate circle. Finn let out a small, strangled whimper. He didn't run. He couldn't. It was held there. I whispered, all wrestling with a sudden, overwhelming dread. The sight of it made the air heavy, metallic. The chains weren't for mooring the dock. They were for containing that. It was a prison. The object, whatever it was, some slow, benthic leviathan, a massive concentration of deep-sea energy, a pocket of the void given volume, completed its circle and then drifted lazily out toward the deeper inlet, heading for the open ocean. The silence that followed was broken only by Finn dropping his thermos, the crash echoing loudly in the sudden absence of the mysterious presence. "It's free, Elias." "We let it out," Finn croaked, before turning and staggering away, leaving the dockyard for good. I stayed until dawn, watching the empty water return to its normal rhythm, but I knew the difference now. I realized that the gouges, the fresh splintering on the ancient wood, were not marks of the chains rubbing the pilings. They were marks of the entity, trying to break its bindings, year after year, until we, in our modern ignorance and eagerness for efficiency, had finished the job for it. Sometimes, the structure itself is the answer, not what the structure held. Rourke got his demolition charges, but the pier was never fully cleared. The local authority, citing unstable geological factors and unforeseen environmental hazards, placed a permanent marine exclusion zone around the site. They didn't use the word haunted or released, but the silence they imposed over that patch of water spoke volumes. They chose to abandon the site, admitting, without language, that a deep and ancient physics had been disturbed. And somewhere out there, gliding through the black water of the strait, the immense, chained thing was finally drifting, unmoored and unbound. I packed my bags that afternoon. I couldn't stay in any place that had just traded a structure for a seal. I traded the cold, metallic dread of the Pacific Northwest for the warmer, equally unforgiving waters off the Oregon coast. The memory of the unchained presence still haunted my peripheral vision, so I sought work far from any coastline I knew, finding a berth on a small, battered fishing cutter named the Salt Iron, run by a laconic, introspective man named Silas. Silas wasn't interested in maximizing his catch. He seemed driven by a quiet compulsion to be out there, perpetually searching the water, not for fish, but for anomalies. We were operating far off the continental shelf, near the edge of the Cascadia subduction zone, an area notorious for unstable bathymetry and unpredictable, deep-running currents. The goal was routine, setting long lines for tuna, ignoring the distant, ominous groan of tectonic plates adjusting beneath us. But the routines began to break. First, the currents. They didn't flow logically. They didn't follow the thermal layers or the predictable eddies. They felt like they were being siphoned, pulled sideways and down with unnatural force. We had to constantly overcorrect our lines, and the fuel consumption spiked wildly as we fought a localized, invisible gravity. Then came the nets. We pulled them up consistently empty of viable fish, which was already strange for these rich waters. But they weren't just empty. They were heavy, dripping with a thick, colloidal black mud, benthic silt that should only be found thousands of meters below, not here on the relatively shallow fishing grounds. "The ocean is trying to clean house," Silas observed one morning, scraping the foul, sticky mud off the deck with grim efficiency. The curiosity peaked when we started sifting through the dregs of the nets, trying to identify the source of the mud. Mixed in with the sediment were objects pulled from the deep. Not the expected flotsam, like plastic bottles or lost fishing gear, but impossibly disparate artifacts, fragments of deeply oxidized steel cable that looked modern, perhaps fiber optic jacket, chunks of densely packed, volcanic rock clearly shaped by human hands, maybe 3,000 or 4,000 years old, and a piece of polished ceramic that looked like Byzantine-era trade pottery. The objects were randomly distributed, jumbled together, all pulled from the same trawl. The implication was that something deep down was collecting material from every possible point in human history, drawing it to a single nexus. This defied everything I knew about sedimentation and deep-sea flow. The idea that artifacts from different continents and epochs could be gathered in a single geographic point, far from any major dumping zone, was absurd. The physics was strained, and soon, the technology followed. Our high-resolution echo sounder, the scientific anchor of our operation, started failing. It was a sophisticated piece of kit designed to map the seabed topography using acoustic pulses. Instead of a smooth contour of the slope, the display showed erratic, nonsensical spikes. "Look at the depth," I said to Silas, pointing to the screen. It cycled rapidly, 3,200 meters, then suddenly 800, then an immediate, clean drop to 10,500 meters, before returning to a reasonable reading. A noise floor error? Silas wondered, running diagnostics. No, the sensor is fine. It's reading a real bottom, but one that shouldn't exist. We're over the continental slope, not the Mariana Trench. I tried to adjust the frequency, thinking it might be reflecting off a temperature boundary, but the erratic deep spike persisted, always in the same location relative to the ship's drift. We decided to abandon the fishing and concentrate fully on the sounder anomaly. We spent the next 48 hours running a tight, low-speed grid pattern, stitching together the fragments of the impossible readings. What emerged, slowly but undeniably, on the chart plotter was not a natural feature. It was a chasm, a sheer void in the seabed, which we soon dubbed the depression. It wasn't a trench formed by a plate boundary, nor was it a volcanic caldera. It was a perfect, V-shaped incision into the abyssal plain. Its sides were too steep, its depth gradient too abrupt, and its geometry too defined to be geological. It looked less like a product of nature and more like a precise, violent scoop taken out of the planet's crust. Using low-power seismic reflection, we estimated the width to be about 500 meters at the top, plunging to a recorded depth that maxed out the machine's capacity, over 11,000 meters. The deepest known parts of the ocean nearby were only half that depth. This depression was an engineered void, a wound in the earth that had no right to be there. The fear now was palpable, mixed with a sickening awe. We were staring at evidence of a force powerful enough to reorganize the planet's crust. We couldn't dive, but we could collect. We fitted a custom-built mud dredge, reinforced with high-strength Kevlar, and dropped it into the center of the anomaly. The dredge weighed half a ton, designed to bite deep into the sediment. When we finally started the winch, the tension cable sang under a weight that suggested we had hooked an anchor the size of a small car. The retrieval was slow, agonizing. When the dredge bag finally broke the surface, it wasn't mud we saw, but an impossible composite, a dense, black amalgam of silt and debris fused together under immense, non-hydrostatic pressure. We opened the dredge on the deck, and the contents spilled out. The noise was like falling gravel. The collection was horrifying. We found pieces of what looked like the ceramic tiles from a deep-sea drilling rig lost decades ago, fused next to meticulously carved wooden effigies from a pre-Columbian culture, and interspersed with them, the twisted remains of something that looked disturbingly organic, perhaps a leviathan bone, but covered in an unnatural, crystal growth. The collection was not merely disparate. It felt curated. "It's a dump site," I muttered, my hands shaking as I picked up a small, perfectly preserved copper coin that might have been minted in the 1700s. Silas shook his head, looking out over the water toward the depression's recorded coordinates. "No, Elias. A dump site is passive. This is active. We are seeing evidence of a force that is pulling everything in, sinking it below the point of tectonic visibility." The mythic/speculative concept solidified. The depression was a siphon, a singular point where the physics of linear time and space were inverted, drawing matter and energy into itself. The anomalous currents we experienced weren't accidental. They were the invisible arms of this abyss force, reaching out across the continental shelf, sweeping the water, and dragging all history toward its center. It was a reverse singularity, a black hole of oceanic time. The dread settled into a heavy resignation. The ocean doesn't hide things from us. It just waits until we forget, and then it quietly takes the things we forgot existed and puts them in a pile where they can never be found again. We were not meant to see the pile. We charted the coordinates, but we didn't report them. Reporting something that violates fundamental geography and history would only invite the curious, and we had learned the deep-sea rule. Curiosity is a death sentence. We turned the salt iron away from the anomaly, leaving the impossible V-shaped chasm to continue its patient collection of civilization's wreckage. Silas looked at the scattered debris on the deck, the pieces of metal and history. It pulls the water the wrong way, he concluded, his voice barely audible above the engine hum. It's always pulling. We leave now before it decides to pull us, too. We ran the rest of the day, leaving the V-shaped scar on the planet's surface alone in the darkness. But every time the ship pitched, I could feel the residual drag of the current, the subtle, persistent tug toward the depression, reminding us that we had barely escaped the pull of impossible gravity. After parting ways with Silas and the unsettling memory of the depression, that great, active wound in the earth, I found myself back ashore, trying to recalibrate my senses in a world where time and gravity seemed stable. I took the lowest key job I could find, maintaining sensor arrays on a small research vessel docked in Port Orford, Oregon. The vessel, the Triton, rarely left the harbor, providing me with the soothing monotony of paperwork and routine system checks. But the silence I craved was immediately broken by sound, and the repetition that had once comforted me became the very instrument of dread. The captain of the Triton, a grizzled veteran named Owen, was a man constantly tethered to his radio room. He spent every Tuesday afternoon at precisely 15:45 hours in a state of anticipatory tension, monitoring the emergency channels. "She'll be here soon," he'd mutter, checking the gain on the VHF frequency. At exactly 15:47, like clockwork, it arrived. A perfectly clear distress signal, overriding all local traffic, sounding as if it were being broadcast from a position just outside the harbor mouth. The voice was synthesized, slightly metallic, female, and utterly devoid of emotion. It recited a precise call sign and location. "Mayday. Mayday. This is the pleasure craft Sandra Marie. We are taking on water rapidly. Request immediate assistance at 42.7 north, 124.6 west. Sandra Marie, repeating, taking on water. We are sinking. Please advise." It was a standard, urgent distress call. But the moment it finished, the transmission immediately repeated. And repeated. And repeated. For exactly 4 minutes, the synthesized voice of the Sandra Marie filled the radio room with its sterile, escalating panic. Then, silence. Until the following Tuesday. Owen had been tracking this ghost transmission for 7 months. Every single week, the same voice, the same coordinates, the same escalating panic, time to the second. The coordinates placed the transmission 50 nautical miles due west of Port Orford, well into the deep, open ocean. Owen, plagued by the genuine urgency in the voice, had been unable to dismiss it. On his first 3 Tuesdays, he had launched the Triton and sped to the coordinates. He found nothing, just empty, gray water. But the technology always told a different story. I was tasked with trying to pinpoint the source using directional antennas and advanced triangulation. The initial mystery was the sheer duration and clarity of the broadcast. Standard EPRB, emergency position indicating radio beacon, batteries, even the specialized deep-sea ones, wouldn't last 7 months broadcasting continuously on a weekly schedule. This was an impossible broadcast cycle. The mythic/speculative concept here was technological haunting, a time loop, a tragedy frozen in the energy signature of the deep. The voice was not calling now. It was calling forever. On my second week aboard, I went out with Owen. We arrived at 42.7 north, 124.6 west, precisely at 15:30. The sea was calm. As 15:47 approached, I armed the passive sonar array and checked the high-resolution radar. The first sound of the Mayday call crackled in the cabin, chillingly close. As the synthesized voice began its monotonous plea, the instruments reacted instantly. The radar, scanning for surface contacts, painted a large, distinct target, a massive, solid echo, perhaps the size of a small freighter, located exactly at the coordinates. "There she is," Owen breathed, his hands gripping the helm. "She appears every time the signal transmits." We raced toward the target area. The radar showed the object, the Sandra Marie, floating perfectly still. But visually, there was nothing. The ocean was empty. I watched the radar display, all giving way to fear. As the 4-minute broadcast cycle approached its end, the solid radar contact began to move. It didn't drift with the current, it sank. Slowly, deliberately, the echo diminished in size on the screen, indicating a descent into the depths, vanishing entirely the moment the transmission cut out. The Sandra Marie was not a ghost ship. It was a ghost of mass, a physical presence tethered to the broadcast cycle. "Why the movement?" I asked Owen. "It's not just broadcasting the sinking, Elias. It's reliving it," he concluded darkly. "Every week, it starts again, and every week, it completes the descent." Driven by the need for a scientific anchor, we returned the next day with specialized sub-bottom profilers. We ran lines directly over the coordinates where the object had vanished. The seafloor here was about 4,000 meters down, mostly soft clay sediment. The profiler quickly revealed an anomaly, a perfect, circular impact crater, a depression in the clay about 30 meters wide and 10 meters deep. It was fresh, geologically speaking, but covered in a fine layer of disturbed deep-sea detritus. This was a classic high-impact signature. Whatever the Sandra Marie was, boat, plane, or something else, it had hit the bottom hard. We dropped the tethered deep-sea camera rig into the center of the crater. The light pierced the black water, revealing the churned mud, and at the very center, the source of the terrible loop. It was an APERB, an emergency position indicating radio beacon, still resting upright in the silt. It was battered, its casing cracked, but its red locator light was still pulsing faintly. We managed to snag the device and winch it to the surface. It was a standard distress beacon, designed for small aircraft or high-end leisure boats. The metal was heavily corroded, covered in abyssal ooze. The moment it came onto the deck, the atmosphere changed. The weekly dread lifted. Owen looked relieved, as if we had finally silenced a screaming child. But the true mystery remained. First, the device was not transmitting anything when we recovered it. Its cycle had been precisely contained by the ocean floor. Second, when I opened the casing, the battery pack was impossible. It wasn't the standard lithium-ion. It was a cluster of dense, ceramic-encased power cells I couldn't identify, connected by wires so fine it was almost invisible. The power reading was near maximum, capable of broadcasting for decades, not months. And third, the records. I checked every official registry, every Coast Guard filing, every NTSB database stretching back 50 years. There was no official record of any vessel, pleasure craft, or otherwise, named the Sandra Marie lost in that area. No Mayday report was logged, save for the weekly automated pickup by passing commercial ships. It was a tragedy that only existed in its repeating broadcast. I realized then that the trauma wasn't just frozen in time. The evidence had been meticulously erased from the surface world, leaving only the technological echo. The deep had claimed the event, concealing the mass of the vessel during the day, sinking it back into the crater at the end of the broadcast cycle, only to release the audio again the next week. The Sandra Marie was a memory that the ocean refused to digest. We carefully documented the device, the strange power source, and the crater. I was proud of the recovery. We had located the anchor of the haunting. But that night, as the Triton lay moored, the radio crackled. It wasn't the Sandra Marie's voice. It was white noise, punctuated by a deep, resonant thump thump thump. Owen, looking pale, grabbed the microphone. "Go ahead, vessel calling." The silence held for a moment, and then a new, low, distorted voice, like rock grinding against rock, filled the cabin. "You took the signal. You erased the evidence. Now who will remember?" Then, silence. Owen frantically tried to raise the source, but it was gone. We had stopped the cycle, yes, but we had inadvertently drawn the attention of whatever unseen force was maintaining that cycle. The ocean doesn't hide things from us. It just waits until we forget, and if we interrupt the mechanism of forgetting, it responds. The next Tuesday, 1547 came and went. The airwaves were silent. We felt safe for a brief moment, celebrating the end of the ghost call. But the silence felt wrong, a false sense of peace. It felt like the removal of a necessary ritual, like snuffing out a warning beacon. I knew we hadn't solved the mystery. We had merely destroyed the last, repeating cry for help, trading the comfort of a known tragedy for the terror of a new, unknown threat. We hadn't silenced the deep. We had merely encouraged it to speak in a new, more immediate language. I packed the mysterious beacon, hiding it away in my duffel bag. We hadn't been supposed to find the transmitter, and we certainly weren't supposed to turn it off. The incident with the Sandra Marie transmission felt like a collision with history, a reminder that some things are meant to stay locked away. My next job took me far south, down the coast of Northern California, seeking environments so controlled and routine that impossible phenomena would struggle to penetrate. I signed on with a marine salvage operation near Bodega Bay, specializing in recovering sensitive equipment from the shallow shelf. I was working alongside a small team of commercial divers. The lead diver was a man named Jax, whose temperament was as cool and unbothered as the deep water he spent his life in. My role was surface support, monitoring communications and safety protocols. Jax had been contracted to inspect a series of geological sensors placed 80 meters down. The water was clear, the bottom sandy, and the environment benign. It should have been an easy dive. Jax was on the bottom for 20 minutes, calmly detailing the sensor readings via the hydroacoustic link. His voice was steady, professional. Then the sound started. It wasn't a roar or a blast. It was a rapid, complex series of high-frequency clicks, thousands of them per minute, sounding entirely mechanical, like a massive clockwork mechanism speeding up uncontrollably. It overwhelmed the voice transmission. It had a crystalline quality, a sound that seemed to be traveling not through the water, but through the molecules of the water itself. "Jax, report." "What is that noise?" I shouted into the comms system. Static, then a single, strained sound from Jax. "It's moving. It's not biological, Elias. It's organized." The clicks intensified, vibrating the surface vessel's hull. They were irregular, yet followed a distinct, impossible rhythm, like a language spoken by metal and light. Then, Jax's panic broke through the cacophony. "I see it. It's a shape. Part here, part not here. Geometric, Elias. It's wrong." His transmission dissolved into a high-pitched shriek of pure audio feedback, followed by total silence. The comms link was down. We hauled Jax up immediately. When he broke the surface, he was conscious, breathing, and physically unharmed. But as soon as we pulled him onto the deck, I knew something terrible had happened. His eyes were wide and unfocused, fixed on a point far above the horizon. He wasn't tracking movement, wasn't acknowledging us. He was catatonic, mumbling a single, repetitive phrase that sounded like "the boundaries. They are drawn in sand." We rushed him to a local clinic. Medically, he was pristine. No decompression sickness, no physical trauma, no elevated cardiac indicators. But mentally, Jax was gone. The diagnosis was transient global amnesia, profound and devastating. He had lost 7 days of memory, not the dive itself, but the 7 days immediately preceding it, a gaping void in his recent past. The contact with the clicking entity hadn't broken his body. It had systematically erased his sense of linear existence, punishing his too close observation by stealing the context of his life. The owner of the salvage vessel, a pragmatic, skeptical woman named Cora, refused to let the incident derail the operation. "We need proof, Elias. Jack saw something, but we need data, not madness." Cora took the next dive herself. She was equipped with a robust, custom-built, passive hydrophone array and a high-definition, deep-rated video camera, the scientific anchor we needed to understand the source. I manned the surface monitors, nerves shredded. She descended slowly, cautiously. At 75 meters, she paused. "I hear the noise," Cora reported, her voice tight but disciplined. "The clicking is here. It sounds like a million typewriters hitting the same key at once." I monitored the hydrophone feed. The sound was even more intricate than I remembered, less like random noise and more like extremely dense, high-frequency data being processed. It lacked the resonance of a biological sound source, like dolphin sonar or whale calls, and it lacked the predictable frequency of any known mechanical engine or geological vent. It was nonspecific. Then, Cora's camera feed started to glitch. The image was relatively clear, sandy bottom, sparse life, the shimmer of particulate matter. But in the center of the frame, where the clicking sound was loudest, was an impossible anomaly. It wasn't a solid creature. It was a moving, three-dimensional void, a pocket of darkness that had physical structure. It was vaguely rectangular, but its edges shimmered and distorted, bending the light around it, yet simultaneously absorbing all light that hit its center. It was the definition of negative volume. "Elias, look at the screen. It's geometry. It's moving with deliberate purpose." Cora's voice was strained, not by fear, but by the sheer cognitive load of trying to describe the indescribable. The clicking phenomenon was happening inside this geometric shadow. Every click was synchronized with a subtle shift in the entity's form, as if the sound was the friction generated by non-physical geometry moving through a physical medium. It was a machine made of pure non-existence, operating on principles that violated Euclidean space. I watched, frozen in awe, as the dark shape glided toward a massive outcrop of rock that Jax had examined minutes before. As the shape passed, the rock outcrop, hundreds of tons of solid basalt, looked like it momentarily flickered, becoming semi-transparent, before snapping back into solidity. It was a momentary breach, a phase shift that lasted milliseconds. Cora was smart. She realized the danger instantly. She didn't approach. "I'm ascending, Elias." Now, she made a controlled ascent, bringing the camera and the hydrophone array back with her. When she surfaced, she was visibly shaken, but intact. She hadn't experienced the click-induced trauma that Jax had. I realized the profound difference. Jax had seen the entity up close, directly, perhaps even felt its resonance. Cora had only documented it from a respectful, professional distance. The mythic/speculative realization was this: exposure to the entity, the silent clicker, was a cognitive hazard. It didn't need to attack. Its very presence was enough to scramble the human mind's perception of reality and memory. We immediately submitted the sound files to a marine acoustics lab. The analysis confirmed my intuition. The clicking frequencies were outside the range of known biological communication, and the structure lacked the periodicity of mechanical noise. The lab report concluded, blandly, that the sound was unattributed complex high-frequency processing. They were unwilling to use the word impossible. Cora and I watched the video playback of the geometric shadow. It moved slowly, deliberately, not hunting, but seemingly engaged in some infinite, internal process. The ocean doesn't hide things from us. It just waits until we forget, or until we look too closely and it forces us to forget. We both looked at Jax, who was now stable but 7 days lighter in his mind, lying in the hospital room. He paid the highest price, curiosity leading to erasure. Cora made the final decision. We classified the video and audio as proprietary deep-sea anomalies, sealed the files, and swore ourselves to silence. We abandoned the contract, leaving the geological sensors and the clicking entity to its slow, rhythmic work. Cora sold the boat and retired inland. I learned the hardest lesson yet. Some things in the deep are not meant to be found, not meant to be understood, and the closest you can get to understanding them is documenting their existence without attempting to cross the boundary. The moment Jax tried to quantify the geometry quantified and then deleted him. I knew I couldn't dive again. I could only watch the surface from a safe distance, haunted by the memory of geometric shadows moving through the liquid dark. After the sterile, calculated horror of the clicking geometry, I swore off the open ocean and retreated entirely to the coast. The safest place, I reasoned, would be within the rigid, predictable architecture of the maritime safety system. I took a low-level maintenance job monitoring navigation aids near Big Sur, California, working far from the trenches, near the venerable, stoic structure of the Pointser Lighthouse. This lighthouse was the ultimate scientific anchor, a tower of predictable, regulated light, overseen by the U.S. Coast Guard, its sequence meticulously timed and recorded. Its flash pattern was standardized, a single, powerful beam repeating every 15 seconds. No variation was permitted, lives depended on that regularity. My task was simple: monitor the automation, log the timings, and report any bulb or reflector degradation. I started logging inconsistencies almost immediately, even before my official shift began. I would stand on the cliff at night, watching the magnificent, sweeping beams slice across the black sky. It felt comforting, a mechanical pulse in the vast, indifferent darkness. But sometimes, when the fog rolled in thick and damp, I would observe the beam timing myself, counting the intervals between the powerful flashes. It wasn't 15 seconds. It was 10. Must be a clock drift, I told myself, checking the automated log housed in the base station. The log, the official record, confirmed the proper timing: 15.01 seconds, 14.99 seconds, perfectly within tolerance. The official record denied my senses. But the faster flash wasn't a one-off error. I continued observing, cross-referencing my watch against the light. Every few hours, the flash rate would jump from 15 seconds to 10, visible to the naked eye for several minutes, before snapping back to the official timing. The mystery deepened when the pattern started to become coded. One exceptionally dark night, I observed the lighthouse running the official 15-second cycle, but then, without warning, it shifted to a complex, short-long-short pattern. I frantically recorded the sequence: 3 seconds, 2 seconds, 1 second. Pause. Then, 5 seconds, 3 seconds, 1 second. Pause. Then, 4 seconds, for seconds. These were not random variations. They were precise, repeated groupings, coded sequences that spoke of deliberate communication. I presented my handwritten logs to my superior, a skeptical, old Coast Guard man named Harvey. He checked the automated logging system, which was infallible, directly connected to the lighthouse mechanism. Elias, the official logs show continuous 15-second intervals. There is no variance, Harvey insisted, tapping the monitor. You're fatigued. The fog plays tricks on your eyes. I knew the difference between optical illusion and observed fact. The machine was reporting one reality, but my eyes were reporting another. The mythic/speculative concept materialized. The structure of the lighthouse was being hijacked by an external intelligence that could manipulate local reality, or at least manipulate the perception of reality, specifically targeting the human observer. The entity was communicating, but only through the medium of light, and only through the uncalibrated sensor of the human eye. I enlisted the help of an off-duty colleague, Clara, a sharp young technician who was deeply mistrustful of my recent erratic behavior. I convinced her to come out one night and observe the tower with me, without the intervention of any technical recording device. Just watch the light, Clara. Don't look at the clock. Tell me what you see. We stood hundreds of meters down the coastline, far enough to appreciate the full sweep of the beam. For 30 minutes, it was the perfect 15-second cycle. Clara gave me a look of impatient derision. Then, the pattern shifted. The beam flashed. Then, a quick pulse. Then, a long, dragging flash. Clara gasped, instinctively confirming the anomaly. That was fast. Was that 10 seconds, Elias? Watch the next one, I urged. The next sequence was even more complex. 3 short pulses, followed by a pause, then one very long, sustained flash. What kind of signal is that? Clara whispered, her skepticism annihilated by the undeniable evidence of her own eyes. It looks like it's counting something, or calling out. The true horror hit when we realized the sequence changed depending on our position. We drove the length of the coastal road, stopping every few kilometers to observe the beam. The patterns were not fixed, they were reactive. When we stopped directly north of the tower, the pattern was 135. When we drove south and stopped again, the pattern instantly changed to 222. The light was communicating with us, or more accurately, responding to our trajectory. The lighthouse wasn't broadcasting a fixed signal. It was engaging in a continuous, complex conversation dictated by the movement of the observer. The scientific anchor was now the study of light refraction and atmospheric distortion. Could atmospheric conditions bend the light just for the human eye, but not for the rigid, filtered lens of the monitoring hardware? This seemed unlikely, as the code was too consistent and structured. The only explanation was a manipulation of the light source itself, executed with a surgical precision that bypassed the Coast Guard's electronic surveillance. The ocean doesn't hide things from us. It just waits until we forget, and sometimes it uses our own tools to remind us. The entity, whatever resided in the abyssal depths off Point Sur, wasn't using sound or physical contact. It was using the most fundamental medium of perception, light. It was trying to talk to the surface world using the only standardized language we offered, the maritime code of the beacon. We checked the lighthouse structure. No external faults, no unauthorized access, no electrical shorts. The giant Fresnel lens rotated perfectly. The bulb glowed steadily. Everything was physically, mechanically sound. The conclusion was inescapable. The entity was either subtly controlling the rate of the mechanism, or it was manipulating the perceived rate of time and light, localized to the position of the human observer. We kept the secret. Clara, like me, quickly understood that bringing this anomaly to official attention would result only in the Coast Guard seizing the tower and replacing all the electronics, erasing the voice forever. We left the lighthouse to its impossible task, recording the coded sequences in a private journal. The final realization was the nature of the message itself. The codes, 321, 531, 222, were complex, repetitive, and ultimately meaningless to us. It wasn't an SOS. It was an effort at primary communication, a vast intelligence attempting to construct a syntax using the only medium it had. It was waiting for someone on the surface to learn its language. We drove away from Point Sur, watching the light flash in the rearview mirror. It was still running the 15-second sequence on the official logs, but I could swear, just before the next flash, I saw a subtle, rapid flicker, a quick, coded double pulse, meant just for the human eye, an invitation to return and decode the message. I knew I would be leaving the coast again soon. The predictable surface world was just a thin veneer, constantly being punctured by the deep. The static echo, the unmoored chains, the depression, the Sandra ghost, the clicking geometry, and now the crooked light. They were all manifestations of the same vast, cold presence, reminding us that we lived on the ceiling of their world, and that their physics was slowly bleeding into ours. The cumulative weight of these anomalies, the impossible fixed radar contact, the chains that had bound the abyss, the geographical wound of the depression, the endless technological ghost loop, the geometry that fractured memory, and the lighthouse that spoke in private code, had taught me one absolute truth. The deep Pacific does not tolerate human inquiry. It is not aggressive in the manner of a shark or a storm. It is aggressively other. It waits, it collects, and it uses our tools and our curiosity against us. I was restless, staying in Bandon, a small, foggy harbor further south on the Oregon coast, trying to find a corner of the world where I could simply stop looking. I was working aboard a small trawler named the Pacific Vale, a vessel as nervous and jumpy as its crew. I was in the wheelhouse one evening, monitoring the VHF emergency frequency, a habit I couldn't break, when the final, shattering event occurred. The frequency, usually filled with static and the distant chatter of trawlers, suddenly cleared, yielding to a precise, toneless digital broadcast. It had the same synthesized quality as the Sandra Marie transmission, but the message was different. Shorter, infinitely more sinister. The voice was perfectly monotone, repeating a single, two-word phrase. Come inside. Come inside. Come inside. The repetition was relentless, looping every 2 seconds. The message wasn't a distress call, not a location, not a code. It was an invitation, or perhaps a command. It lacked any call sign, any coordinate, or any identifying marker. I frantically tried to triangulate the source, but the signal was simultaneously everywhere and nowhere, blanketing the entire region. It felt like the voice was broadcast not through the air, but from the water itself. Captain Harlan, an old fisherman whose intuition had guided him through decades of storms, grabbed the microphone. Identify yourself. This is a restricted channel. The voice simply continued, flat and persistent. Come inside. Come inside. Harlan slammed the throttle to neutral. He didn't look at the radio, didn't look at me. He looked at the water outside the pilot house window, his face a mask of ancient dread. We go back. Now, Elias. Full speed, back to the dock. I was baffled. The weather reports were clear, the sea state was mild, and we were only 3 hours into a planned 3-day trip. Why? What is that? A prank. That is the water telling us to stop, Harlan hissed, his voice raw. Don't you recognize the sound of absolute authority? When the water speaks, you listen. He didn't hesitate. He spun the Pacific Vale around, fighting the current, and ran toward Bandon Harbor. What happened next was a demonstration of a power that surpassed the subtle terror of the anomalies I had encountered before. This was overt, geological control. As we raced back, the come inside loop continued, but it was punctuated by a new, physical phenomenon. A low-frequency vibration, a heavy, disorienting thrum that settled deep in the chest cavity. It felt like standing inside a massive, muffled bell. This infrasound was so deep, so profound, that it felt less like a wave traveling through air or water, and more like the sound of the entire planet groaning under stress. The disorienting pulse intensified for about 30 seconds, and then the transmission stopped. The frequency went dead silent. The low thrum faded. We reached the harbor entrance minutes later. The place was chaos. Every single vessel, from the smallest pleasure skiff to the largest commercial crab boat, was crammed into the harbor. No one had been officially warned of a storm, yet every captain, like Harlan, had instinctively turned for safety. The come inside broadcast had been a universal, deeply rooted alarm clock for the entire maritime community. We tied up the Pacific Vale, and Harlan and I went to the end of the dock to watch the now empty entrance channel. The sun was setting, casting long, bruised shadows over the bay. The ocean outside the breakwater, usually restless and dark, was still. Impossibly still. It wasn't just calm, it was inert. The wave action ceased entirely. The movement of the water stopped, as if the surface tension had become unnaturally high. It was the silence of a perfectly polished mirror reflecting nothing. Look, Harlan whispered, pointing a trembling finger. The water level began to rise. It didn't come in as a storm surge or a tide. It rose vertically, silently, with a deliberate, unnatural speed that defied gravity and fluid dynamics. It crept over the high tide line, slipping across the wooden pier, not rushing, not splashing, but simply increasing its volume. It moved past the moorings, climbed the pilings, and covered the deck of a nearby skiff with quiet, ominous efficiency. It rose far beyond any known tidal maximum, creeping inland toward the parking lot. The ocean was not raging. It was simply filling its container. The mythic/speculative concept of the inverted ocean crystallized in that terrifying moment. The source of the broadcast wasn't predicting a weather event. It was initiating a change in the physical rules of the system. The voice that commanded, "Come inside," was the entity that controlled the very volume and behavior of the water. The realization settled with crushing finality. The deep-sea anomalies, the echo, the chains, the depression, weren't random horrors. They were mechanisms maintained by this underlying intelligence. The voice had warned the vessels to take shelter, not because a storm was coming, but because it was about to make the water behave impossibly. We stood on the dock for an hour, watching the silent flood creep to an arbitrary height, hold for 20 minutes, and then, with the same impossible silence and speed, retreat back down the pilings, settling exactly at the standard high tide mark, as if the entire event were a brief, localized test of force. The lesson was learned, absolute and terrifying. The strength of the deep is not in violence, but in control. The ocean doesn't hide things from us. It just waits until we forget, and then it reminds us that we are only permitted to exist on its surface by its constant, quiet grace. If it asks us to come inside, it's not inviting us into the harbor. It's inviting us into its laws, laws we cannot survive. Harlan, like all the other fishermen, never spoke of the voice. But we learned to recognize the warning sign, the overcalmness of the water, the strange, dead stillness that precedes a total violation of physics. That silence means the water is listening and preparing to move in a way that is utterly foreign to the surface world. I left the coast that week. I now live as far inland as I can manage, occasionally listening to the old hydrophone recordings I brought back, the sound of the static, the grinding plates, the crystalline clicking. But I am always aware that the physics I rely on, the simple, comforting rules of gravity and buoyancy, are arbitrary. They are a temporary permission slip granted by something impossibly vast and impossibly cold, waiting in the midnight abyss. The pressure eases now. The hypnotic rhythm of the hydrostatic crush is fading, and the static that governed our descent is smoothing out, becoming merely the gentle rush of air in the headphones. You can finally take that deep breath you've been holding since we started. The ambient light of your room should feel warmer, less hostile, than the darkness we've just visited. The stories end here, but the consequences linger. We found the mechanism